Hey there! So in the last lecture, I gave you a high-level overview about how HTML and CSS are processed in the browser. Now in this lecture, we're going to start to look at the CSS parsing phase, because a lot of important stuff happens in this phase. Now, just before we start, let's do a quick review of the official terms that we can find in a CSS rule, just so that we're all on the same page in these lectures and the coding videos. So, a rule consists of a selector and a declaration block. As you know, we use a selector to select one or more HTML elements that we want to style. Then in the declaration block is where we write the actual styles in order to style elements on our page. To do so, we can write one or more CSS declarations in each declaration block. Each declaration consists of a CSS property and its corresponding value, which is the value that we assign to a property. This value we assign to a property is called the declared value. Alright, and that's it. Very simple. So let's now talk about the first step of the CSS parsing phase. First off, remember that in the parsing phase, the first step is to resolve conflicting CSS declarations, and the second step is to process the final CSS values. So let's start with step 1 in this lecture, which is the cascade, and let's define exactly what it is. So, the cascade is the process of combining different style sheets and resolving conflicts between different CSS rules and declarations when more than one rule applies to a certain element. Because, as you probably already know, a declaration for a certain style property like font size can appear in several style sheets and also several times inside one single style sheet. Now, CSS can also come from different sources. The most common one is the CSS that we, the developers, write. These declarations that we put in our style sheets are called the author declarations. Another source can be the user declarations, which is CSS coming from the user. For instance, when the user changes the default font size in the browser, then that is user CSS. And last but not least, there are the default browser declarations. For instance, if we put an anchor tag in our HTML for a link, and then don't style it at all, it will usually be rendered with blue text and underlined, right? That's called the user agent CSS, because it's set by the browser. So the cascade combines the CSS declarations coming from all these different sources. But how does the cascade actually resolve conflicts when more than one rule applies? Well, what it does is to look at the importance, at the selector specificity, and the sourced order of conflicting declarations, in order to determine which one takes precedence. And here's how that works. First off, the cascade starts by giving the conflicting declarations different importances, based on where they are declared, so based on their source. The most important declarations are user declarations marked with the important keyword. You already know the important keyword in CSS, right? If not, I'm going to show you an example in a second. Next, the second most important declarations are the author declarations marked with important. Third, the normal author declarations, then the normal user declarations, and finally, the least important ones are the default browser declarations, which actually makes a lot of sense, so that we can easily override these declarations coming by default from the browser. But we should better look at an example here, right? So here we have two rules which both apply to the button class, and we have two conflicting declarations about the background color. These are both author declarations, but if you look closely in the first rule, the declaration with the blue background color contains the important keyword, and therefore this declaration is more important, as we can see from our table. This means that this is a declaration that gets precedence, and so we see that our button is indeed blue. Great! Does it make sense to you? I'm sure it does. And we'll see a lot more examples later on. Now, a lot of times we will just have a bunch of conflicting rules in our author style sheets without any important keyword. That is actually the most common scenario, and in this case all the declarations have the exact same importance. Now, what happens in this case? What the cascade does if this is the case is to calculate and compare the specificities of the declaration selectors. And this is how it works. Inline styles have the highest specificity, followed by IDs, then classes, pseudo-classes and attribute selectors, and finally the least specific, the element and pseudo-element selector. So when we have conflicting declarations with the same importance as we saw in the last slide, we calculate their selector specificity based on the priorities I just showed you. But let's see how we actually calculate specificities with a small example. That's always best, right? First off, all these declarations have the same importance because they're all author declarations. So let's calculate their selector specificities in order to find out if the background color will be either blue, green, purple, or yellow. And this is how we do it. The specificity is actually not just one number, but one number for each of the 4 categories I showed you before: inline styles, IDs, classes, pseudo-elements, and attributes, and finally elements. And for each of these, we count the number of occurrences in the selector. Simple as that. So here in selector 1, we don't have any inline styles, of course, because an inline style has to be written in the HTML, which is not the case here. So it's a 0. We also have no IDs here, so it's again a 0. But we do have one class, the button class, and so for the classes category we have a 1. And finally, there's no element selector here, so 0 for that one as well. And that's it. This selector specificity is 0, 0, 1, 0. Great. Let's now compare it to the others. The next one is also not an inline style, so 0 for the first one. Now, here we actually have an ID selector for the nav ID, right? So it's a 1 for the ID. We also have 2 classes, pull right and button, so it's a 2 for the classes category. And finally, there are also 2 element selectors here, the nav element and the div element, which means that it's also a 2 for the elements category. So finally, the specificity to this selector is 0, 1, 2, 2, which is actually a highly specific selector. Selector number 3 is very simple. It's just an element selector, and so the specificity is 0, 0, 0, 1. And now the last one, selector number 4. First again, we have the nav ID, so it's 1 for the ID. Next, we have a class, the button class, and also a pseudo class, which is hover, which makes it 2 for the classes category in total. And since there's also one element selector, the final specificity is 0, 1, 2, 1. Make sense? Now, you're probably wondering, well, this is all great, but how do we actually use these numbers to find out which of the selectors applies? We start to look at the numbers from left to right, starting with the most specific category, the inline styles. If there is a selector with 1, it wins against all the other selectors, because this is the most specific category. Well, this is not the case here, so let's move on to the IDs. We see that selector 2 and 4 have a 1 here, while the others have 0. So the ones with 0 are out of the game, because they are less specific than selectors 2 and 4, the ones with the IDs. Okay? Now, since both selectors have a 1 in this category, we have to move on and check the classes. They both have a 2 in this category, so it's still a tie between them. And finally, in the elements category, the selector 2 has a 2, while the selector 4 has only 1. And so we have a winner here. The selector number 2 is the most specific selector of all, and so it will give our button a green background. The value of the winning declaration is called the cascaded value, because it's the result from the cascade. So, we start with a bunch of declared values, in this case blue, green, purple, and yellow, and one of them wins and becomes the cascaded value, which is in our example green. Now imagine selector 4 also had 2 elements. Then both selectors 2 and 4 would have the exact same specificity, right? So, what happens in this case? And I promise you, it's almost over now, okay? Well, if there's still a tie at this point, then the last CSS declaration written in the code is the one that will apply. So again, if everything is equal, if all the declaration selectors have the same specificity, then it's simply the last declaration that will be used to style the selected element. That's it. Now, just before we finish this lecture, let me give you a quick summary and overview of the most important things we just learned. This is essentially what you should really retain from this lecture. First off, we learned that CSS declarations marked with the important keyword have the highest priority when multiple declarations are in conflict. But you should only ever use important as a last resource. If something doesn't work the way you think it should, then look at your selector specificities and figure out what's going on. That's always better than just adding important, which may solve the problem in an easier way, but will cause you problems in the long run. Remember the talk about maintainable code? Well, thinking about specificities and using important only as the last resource is one of the things that will make your code more maintainable for the future. The next thing to remember is that inline styles that you write in your HTML will always have priority over styles you write in an external style sheet. But since using inline styles isn't such a good practice anyway, this one isn't all too important. Next, a selector that contains even only one ID is more specific than one with 1,000 classes. So if you want to be really specific, use an ID. In the same way, a selector with one class is more specific than one with 1,000 elements, of course. One thing that is really important to note is that the universal selector has no specificity value, and so it's 0, 0, 0, 0, which means that all other selectors have a precedence over it. We will see how and why when we start coding our project. Another thing that you should note is that it's best to always rely more on specificity than on the order of selectors. This way, if you someday rearrange all your CSS code, you won't have any surprises which could mess up your entire code. This again makes your code a lot easier to maintain, which is hugely important. Now, there's actually one case where you do need to worry about the order of selectors, and that's when you're using external third-party style sheets. Imagine, for instance, that you include something like a reset style sheet, which defines a couple of styles for common elements. In this case, of course, you want your style sheet to be able to override those third-party styles if necessary. And so your own style sheet should be the last one to be included in the HTML. So in this case, the order is actually hugely important. Alright, and that's actually all there is to know about the cascade and specificity in CSS. So if you ever wondered what the cascading word in cascading style sheets actually means, now you know it. Great, right? And the best part is that understanding all of this will now allow you to write better, cleaner and more maintainable CSS code.